Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Saudi Arabia is obviously the largest, wealthiest, and most important country in the Arabian Peninsula. The Sunni House of Saud considers the militant Shiite regime in Tehran its sworn enemy. There is thus common cause between the Saudis and the Israelis, as well as with the Trump administration in Washington. What is the current state of affairs in this triangle? To analyze this topic, we're joined from another location in central Israel by Dr. Lerman, who is the vice president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and a lecturer at Shalem College. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome from another location here in Jerusalem, Dr. Boms, who is a research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Welcome.
Thank you.
And here with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren. Give us a broader understanding on the Saudi relations with both Israel and the United States. To what degree is it really intertwined, of course, vis-a-vis the malign activities of the Islamic Republic of Iran in our region, as well as the prospects of a overt rapprochement between Jerusalem and Riyadh, considering the clear interests that are aligned at this specific period of time?
So on the highest level, the Americans and the Saudis have marked earlier this year the 75th anniversary of the meeting between President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and King Ibn Saud on the USS Quincy on the Bitter Lake when FDR, when President Roosevelt was heading back from the Yalta conference to Washington. This was a couple of months before he died prematurely. And what one can see throughout these 75 years is that there are three topics. First, there were two, but then the third one came along. Two topics are over all others impacting the Saudi-Israeli relations. One is the Israeli-Palestinian or the larger Israeli-Arab conflict, and the other one is the big power competition in the region. And then, for the last 41 years, after the revolution in Iran, it's what is happening in the Persian or Arabian Gulf and the Iranian-Israeli relationship. So we can talk about all of these topics, but what one can say, just to sum it up, is first of all, the Americans, who are the benefactors of the Saudis, but also want to sell them arms and have some influence over their oil production, the Americans are on the way out, at least as long as Donald Trump is in office. He has signaled it not only in the Middle East, but also in Germany only a few days ago when he unilaterally decided to take out 1/4 or 1/3 of American personnel there. So the Americans are out and the Russians are probably in. We have seen it in Syria and in other places. As for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Saudis are not pushing too much for Israeli concessions, but they want to have something along the lines of the Abdallah initiative, that is the late King Abdallah of Saudi Arabia some 18 years ago. And what we have seen recently with Israeli declarations of annexation of parts of the West Bank, this is not going to help the Saudis support Israel or support the American support of Israel on it, because while they have good security and intelligence cooperation with Israel, this cannot be expressed. This must remain under the table. And if they have to take a stand on the West Bank and especially on Jerusalem, because they want to be the custodians of Temple Mount, of Al-Aqsa. They are the custodians of Mecca and Medina, and they see themselves as the custodians of the third holiest site in Islam, which is Jerusalem. So all in all, while the Saudis would want Israel to help them against Iran, they cannot do it publicly.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the recent several years has been very vocal about a certain covert rapprochement between Israel and the Sunni moderate world, quote unquote, which he sees as a very important journey for Israel's integration or assimilation within the Middle East, of course, to a certain extent only, as it aspires to be more Western than Eastern, but at the same time, we see the vocality countered by various meetings between Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas going to Riyadh and receiving favor from the king of the Saud family, and then having different meetings. Of course, not always the warmest relations between Riyadh and Ramallah, but there is still a repeated declaration of support for the so-called Palestinian cause by the Saudis towards the Palestinians, while all the while shunning the capacity or possibility of overt rapprochement between Riyadh and Jerusalem, so long as the Palestinian issue remains. How do you see this two-way street, if you will, with some roadblocks in the middle going on as of late?
Well, this has to really be broken into its different components, because on the Palestinian issue, Israel understands, I think, that there's a limit to how much the Saudis can put distance between their position and that of the Palestinian Authority. We do need the Saudis to make a very clear, to draw a very clear line against Hamas, and even clearer line against other radical elements in the region, such as Hezbollah. You know, the Saudis led the Arab League into declaring Hezbollah a terrorist organization, something that half the nations of Europe have not yet done. So it very much varies on which angle are you looking at. There are many things on which Israel and Saudi Arabia have come to very profound understandings. On the Palestinian question, I think the main interest of Israel is right now not to necessarily to have a Saudi embassy in Tel Aviv, let alone Jerusalem, but rather for others in the international community and in the region to know that there is no enmity between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and therefore you can safely do business with Israel, if this is in your interest, without the risk of being clobbered over the head by Saudi reactions.
Indeed.
This has made possible some of the very important breakthroughs in places like Chad and more recently Sudan vis-a-vis the Burhan government, but also further afield. Just one minor, small, negligible example by the name of India, a nation of $1.25 billion, which is a friend of Israel, and for years was very shy about being seen with us in public, largely because they had millions of people working in the Gulf as expatriates. They had their oil supply coming from there, and they worried. They no longer worry. They don't longer have to look behind their back, behind their shoulder to see if the Saudis are coming after them because of their relationship with Israel. This is far more important than any overt relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia at this point in time.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, your take on this?
Well, we see some recent developments, but if we look carefully, they're not that recent. In 2002, following an article of Thomas Friedman, we've learned about a new Saudi initiative, endorsed later at the Arab League Summit of 2002, which later became the regional initiative, of the idea that at some point we can have a track led by Saudi Arabia, involving the moderate Sunni states, that will be a path for peace in the Middle East. This was something that was almost a side comment, because very few serious advances have occurred with it. But in the last few years, it's actually became front and center, particularly because of what we've just heard from my two colleagues. We have another, I would say, two important developments. One is that we have a new leadership in Saudi Arabia that is willing to make some more of this U-turn. Mohammed bin Salman, the commander-in-chief that is taking Saudi Arabia to a number of new directions. has started a number of interesting initiatives, including engaging with the Jewish community, including engaging with interesting forums and in that period you see him speak about Israel as well. Following the Khashoggi affair that caused other problems to his plan, he actually continued and sent Muhammad Ali, the head of the most important Saudi religious organizations, the Muslim World League, to continue this type of engagement, meeting some Israelis in a historic place, a symbolic place, such as the Auschwitz concentration camp. And that is another indication that there is now an inter-religious dialogue, which is, again, something symbolic, more public, which stands side by side with the understanding geopolitical dialogue, understanding that the Iran issue is still very much in place, and also that the Palestinian issue is changing course. I will just end by saying that one of the interesting things we've seen very recently is comments, Saudi comments on the Palestinian file that are very different than what we've seen before. Some Palestinians were not seeing this warming up between Israel and the Saudis, and broadly the warming up of relations between Israel and the moderate Arab states, and have commented about it. And then you've seen Saudi responses, very harsh responses, saying to the Palestinians, look, you should not bite the hand that feeds you. You should really not intervene in this. You are really not even very much belong to this region. Just move away. We have more important issues at hand. We need to deal with this region. Stop holding us hostage and let us take the lead. And this is all of these factors really joined together.
Mr. Oren?
This may come as a shock to you, but Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, not in the liberal Western style. The House of Saud is very conservative. Of course, there are some 5,000, 7,000 princes and other titled elites ruling some 34 million other Saudis. And the dilemma or the paradox is that Mohammed bin Salman is forward-looking, is trying to bring Saudi Arabia into the 21st century, but he is doing it by authoritarian means. So people in the West who would welcome what he is doing are not too fond of how he is doing it. And Nir mentioned, you mentioned the Khashoggi affair and other human rights problems. And therefore, U.S. Congress, in a bipartisan way, Republicans as well as Democrats, do not support arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which is one of President Trump's main achievements, the way he portrays it. He wants to have jobs for American industry. He wants to maintain influence in the region through arms sales, and Congress is against it. And therefore, Mohammed bin Salman is not getting any return on his investment. So there's a problem there. Now, in a few weeks' time, we are going to mark the 30th anniversary of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which was supposed to get into Saudi Arabia as well, had the United States and others not intervened. And this was the shock which awakened Saudi Arabia and let the other powers have bases in Saudi Arabia, which was unthinkable until August of 1990. But one of the prices for that was the Madrid peace process following the first Gulf War in 1991. So these two issues of how to reach an Israeli-Palestinian accord, along with Jordan and Syria and others, and what is happening in the Gulf, be it Iraq as the aggressor or later Iran, these two issues are still going to be intertwined.
Dr. Lerman?
Well, at the end of the day, the Trump administration has changed the rules of the game by going to Saudi Arabia and Israel as his first stations, not only without seeing any contradiction, but as a complementary act. Because the first priority for the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, at least in the region, and to some extent even in terms from the United States point of view, in terms of its long-term global responsibility, to the extent that you can speak about responsibility in the context of this administration, is the Iranian challenge, the Iranian nuclear challenge. This is the one thing that could turn the entire world upside down if we find ourselves in a situation where the NPT has collapsed and there's a nuclear race by half a dozen countries. So the importance of the Iranian issue for the three countries is such that everything else right now pales in comparison. From time to time, there are things from the from the coronavirus crisis to the Palestinian issue that distract our attention from the focal point. But this is the focal point. And the Saudi position towards Israel was forged during the Obama years, when they felt that Israel was the only one willing and able to raise effective action in Washington against an American position which they saw as an abandonment of their most vital national interests.
So the famous bow of former President Barack Obama to King Salman at the time was in clear contradiction of his actual actions towards Saudi Arabia, which were quite the opposite. As you say, there emerged a certain vacuum in the region which impacted Saudi Arabia and Israel, which even for American administrations which are isolationist in essence, still need to keep in mind that they have strategic interests in the region in order to assure that their isolationist attitudes can be maintained.
Indeed.
Indeed. Dr. Boms, how do you take this current attitude of rapprochement between the two sides at a time when even the Trump administration, of course, America first, and everything that pertains to American foreign policy pertains to America first, is still an attitude of keeping in mind that keeping Saudi Arabia or Israel safe is in the interests of Washington and is in line with protecting the homeland?
Well, the broader strategic interest remains intact, certainly following the turn that was made in the United States regarding the JCPOA, regarding the Iran deal. This is clear that Iran remains a strategic problem. It also clears that it remains a strategic problem not only to the United States, but also to the majority of other partners in the region. And it's also remains clear that this problem is not going away. Looking at what is happening in Syria, looking at what's happening in Yemen, looking at what's happening in Libya to a certain degree. And therefore, even the isolationists understands that they're not able to completely divorce themselves from the region. At the same token, coronavirus, oil crisis means that the foreign actors will need to work harder to convince those who needs to be convinced, certainly in the United States, that we need to spend additional resources in order to remain more involved. That is going to be one of the important debates in the United States in the months ahead. And that is certainly what is happening in Saudi Arabia, that now needs to reorient some of its own vision 2030 because of corona crisis, because of oil crisis, understanding that some of the very ambitious plans will have to be cut down. They had to raise taxes. Now they may be able to gain a little bit of additional income from the expected continuing increase in the price of oil. But what had happened in the past few months has been really a depletion of resources, certainly for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, because of corona crisis, oil price, and juxtaposed with the oil crisis, we have a sharp decrease in demand. And that means that, again, all of these ambitious plans are becoming, again, with a question mark as to what they will be able to do in the future.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask you specifically about the fact that over the years, Israel has been, of course, helping Saudi Arabia, at least recent years, in Washington with all that pertains to its capacity to influence decision-making in Congress and so on. But at the same time, there are certain countries in Europe, including France and Britain and even Spain, that are heavily invested in Saudi Arabia, have close relations with the family of Saud and the king and the senior figures within the royal family. To what degree do you think that Israel could actually urge the Saudis to return the favor by influencing European strongholds, by bringing about certain influences in Paris or London vis-a-vis Israeli interests in the region?
Well, there is this myth of Israel's power on Capitol Hill and through it influencing executive branch decisions. Some of this myth is based on reality. And indeed, American administrations throughout the years, when they wanted to have some support from the Jewish community in the United States, came to Israel asking Israeli leaders and ambassadors to help them gain this support in the community and on Capitol Hill through senators and representatives. And Israel has also made use of this power to help certain countries such as Turkey when it was out of favor, as well as others. But this power was more of a deterrent than a decisive force. And when Israel started to battle President Reagan regarding the Saudi purchase of the AWACS warning and control aircraft, it lost. So Israel has to make a very judicious use of this power, and only when it really must do it. In Europe, Israel doesn't have such power, especially since its foreign policy seems to diverge from that of the major powers of the European Union. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas was in Israel last week, specifically regarding those indications of Israeli ambitions to annex parts of the West Bank, which Germany and France and other European powers are not in favor of. So how can Israel help Saudi Arabia elsewhere? But just as an aside, Saudi Arabia is in some sense the Jordan of the 21st century as regards Israel. Jordan was a silent security partner of Israel years before it signed a formal peace treaty between King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin. And to some extent, the security and intelligence relationship right now between Riyadh and Tel Aviv is similar, which means that there will be years and maybe decades before it goes out into the open through a formal recognition and, as was mentioned, the exchange of ambassadors.
Well, I was actually meaning, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Lerman, to have your take on this with regard to Saudi influence on European capitals, whether it could come to the aid of Israel in trying to secure more support in Europe than it actually receives right now, considering the clear-cut differences between Brussels, specifically the European Union and Strasbourg, vis-a-vis, of course, Jerusalem.
Well, I don't think the Saudis are going to waste their precious diplomatic capital on helping or detracting from Israel's position right now. They have a much bigger set of issues. Of course, in Europe, which positions itself from time to time as the arbiter of good behavior or bad behavior in world affairs, the Khashoggi murder left a stain on Saudi Arabia's reputation. We may also feel down the road the aftershocks of the dramatic change in the energy markets, which make much of the world, Europe included, less dependent on Saudi policy than it has been in the past. So the relationship is focused on other issues at this stage. I don't see the Saudis as a major player in the game that's about to ensue between Israel and Europe over the application of law or the gradual implementation of the Trump plan by Israel. But the fact that Saudi Arabia is not an overt enemy of Israel is in itself a factor for many European countries that for years, as I said, like the Indians, like the Africans, like Brazil and others, used to worry about the Saudi position. And this is no longer a consideration. This in itself is the most important aspect for Israel.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, and I'd like to give each and every one of you a closing short analysis, as we don't have very much time. Dr. Boms, we'll start with you.
MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, is going to be there for a while. He is taking the time to recover from the Khashoggi affair and now from the economic crisis, and we will hear more, and I'm sure we will see some leadership and some new ideas coming from this country as we have seen before.
Indeed. Dr. Lerman?
Just one sentence. This is not Saudi Arabia alone. We look at the duo, MBS and MBZ. And the Emirates are in many ways Israel's backdoor to Saudi Arabia, because there the level of coherence between the Israeli and the Emirati positions on practically every question, from Iran to Libya to the Muslim Brotherhood to the future of Egypt and so on, the level of closeness and coherence is such that it must reflect also on our relations with Saudi Arabia.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
Saudi Arabia used to be the leader of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And because of the rift with Qatar, there is no GCC to speak of, and the Americans are trying to mediate between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. If they manage to do it, along with the gains in Iraq, where Mustafa Kadhimi seems to be a very effective leader, then there is hope for the future. Now, there is a problem with proportion and perception. The Palestinian problem is very small compared to other problems. It's like the keyhole in a door. The keyhole is very small if you look at the entire door, for instance, in this studio. But without putting the key into the keyhole and turning it, the door will not open. And the keyhole to Saudi Arabia is the Palestinian issue.
Well, hopefully they find the right key someday, because it doesn't appear that way. But this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Dr. Boms, Dr. Lerman, as well as Mr. Oren for being with us on today's panel. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.